Hey friendos, it's Andy here. I don't have a fun intro for you this week because we had a bunch of people in town playing some Magic all weekend. I'm exhausted, I don't have any good ideas, but I do want to announce something fun, which is that we are going to be doing the first ever Lucky Paper Radio Book Club. We're going to be reading The Beauty of Games by Frank Lance over the next few weeks and then talking about it on the show. So if you want to play along, you should order a copy for yourself and read it. It is available directly from the publisher, which is the MIT Press. You can buy it on the MIT Press bookstore. You can also, I'm sure, ask your local bookstore to get a copy for you. Do not buy it from If you do, you are dead to me. Not exactly sure we're going to be recording our episode for it, probably in something around 6 weeks. So you got a little bit of time, but get yourself a copy of the book and follow along with us. All right, here is the episode. Are you ready to make a podcast now?
Yes.
Do you feel awake, engaged, alive? Great. In that case, let's make an episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony Cuckminster Fuller-Maddox. I forget how that came up at a party, but it came into my mind, and I could not say it.
Yeah, sometimes that happens with the brain. It just gets stuck on. It's very funny. I don't really get it.
There's nothing to get,
doesn't really apply, except you just like...
You like Buckminster Fuller and, Buck and Cuck? What could you ask for?
Those are definitely two words that sound similar.
Words that sound like other words.
Them around. That's a good question, though. I haven't revisited my enthusiasm for Buckminster Fuller in a couple years, and I wonder, as I've been learning more about the way that technology and sort of future-looking people are actually overall pretty bad people, maybe he's not...
You think overall people that are like futurists tend towards being bad people?
I think it's worth some revisiting. I don't know. He made some weird cars. He made domes. Everybody loved those domes.
Basically the one weird car.
The one weird car. Literally one. I think it was one prototype.
That it was
model.
an awful crash in one of its test drives for the media and therefore was abandoned.
Anyway, fun guy.
I think some people think cuck is a swear word because it has the consonant sounds of a swear word. And I just want to clarify, this show, we are not going to yuck anybody's yum. If you're into cuckoldry, good for you. Go chase your bliss.
Okay, this is an episode. We're going all kinds of directions.
Well, I want to clarify that I'm not going to bleep it. And I feel like people are going to be like, it's a swear word. It's not a swear word. It's just a thing some people can be. Really what it's evidence of is that a weird problem with politics is that it's way more fun.
We were not off topic enough. We have to bring in politics.
We haven't even introduced the topic yet. What are we off topic on, Anthony? I think a weird problem with politics.
Let's see. Hit us with that weird problem with politics.
There's a couple, but the one weird one I'm talking about right now is that it's way more fun to be a right-wing nut job than it is to be a reasonable person. They have way better insults for people. They get to call us all cucks, which I think is great for them. I mean, it's a good insult, is what I'm saying.
Okay. So you're saying we got to come up with some really good insults.
Well, I mean, they have the whole let's go Brandon thing, and they get to call us cucks and snowflakes, and we're just oh, you're a bunch of deplorables. That's the best we can do, really, for the most part.
I could come up with some better words.
But is it fun, or is it just depressing?
No, it's just depressing.
Yeah, see?
I mean...
It's got to be fun. You got to make it fun.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we are staying on topic, but I just listen. Do you listen to Tech Won't Save Us? I feel like it's not fun and goofy enough for you.
It's not funny enough, I don't think. I think I listened to a couple episodes and I was
They just did a breakdown of this guy, Balaji, and he's just a straight up fascist. It's just this is
we have those still.
Straight up Nazi stuff, and it's insane.
Who is he actually? Is he a leader of a country?
He's like a Y Combinator guy.
Oh.
And it's this whole tech circle is just wow. It's really weird living in a society that we're just not holding these people accountable for the stuff they're doing. Anyway, I'm having way too much coffee right now. It's great.
How does that have anything to do with what I asked you?
I don't know. Buckminster Fuller, maybe he wasn't such a great guy.
I don't know. I guess the jury's out on old Bucky. He made those cool balls all those kids choked on.
No, he didn't. Those were just named after him.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Because they happened to make geometric forms that reminded the inventor of his various...
Of the domes.
Domes.
And you don't choke on them. They just
they get
stuck in your intestines and pinch.
Also, I have not looked this up, but I'm going to go ahead and speculate that has happened almost no times, and it's just a panic, a moral panic, or not a moral panic, I guess, but like a safety panic around.
Yeah, a lot of.
I bet it's overblown.
Woke snowflakes couldn't tolerate the magnet balls. Meanwhile, you can just go into a Walmart and buy a shotgun.
Yeah, like we can't have Kinder toys or whatever because kids might choke on them, but firearms, fine. Anyway.
All right, it's been a great episode.
I called you Cuckminster Fuller because he designed some buildings, and today I want to talk about my overarching theory of the world, which is that everything is exactly the same. Do you consider yourself more of a generalist or more of a specialist?
Interesting. I mean, I don't love labeling myself, but I would say
before you say neither, somewhere in between.
Let's say generalist, because I enjoy thinking about the connections between different subjects more than going really, really deep into particular ones, even though, I got a job and I've been doing the same thing.
You've got a COD book.
I have a book on COD, yes. Yeah, the people at my local bookstore sometimes give me some looks. They're like, this is a weird list of stuff you're buying.
Just be like, it's gifts. It's always gifts.
Yeah, it's not.
I definitely consider you a generalist, and I consider myself a generalist too. For me, at least, it's more that I feel like I can't learn things in a vacuum. Like, if I'm going to make something stick into my head, it needs to be connected to this web of everything in order for it to make sense.
Yeah, I mean, to give a really concrete example, we've been playing GeoGuessr, and at some point, I think both of us were like, let's learn all the country flags. That's a really easy way to rack up some wins in GeoGuessr. And for me, I can't just look at the flags and just memorize them rote. But if I go and be like, okay, let me read the Wikipedia page on the history of this flag, and it's like, okay, a lot of them are pretty bland. It's like, we chose blue because of the ocean and green because of our great agriculture. But a lot of them also have really interesting history where it's like, well, we used to have this, and then we were overthrown by this group of people, and they added this emblem, and then somebody else added this reference to something else. And as soon as I can connect it to some sort of historical context, then it can actually stick in my mind. Plus, you get the added benefit of now you're going to learn about something else, and it's going to connect to those facts later in the future.
Yeah. I like the flags that are just a drawing of the country, like the flag for the Gambia.
Those are helpful.
Where it's just a river down the middle of a flag.
I actually forget the Gambia flag. I mean, I trust
you.
Go
ahead and guess.
I can picture
Go ahead and
the shape of the Gambia.
Create it from scratch and then look it up.
What do you mean? It's 3 bars. There's no picture of the country here.
It's the blue. It's the river. I just remember this one because the blue represents the river down running east-west down the middle of the country.
It's a very abstract idea. I thought you meant it was literally just an outline of the country.
Pretty close to an outline of the country. The Gambia is just basically a big line.
It's got wiggles.
Yeah, I know it's got wiggles. But yes.
Sorry, meanders.
I feel like you and I are both that way to some degree, where I need things to connect to other things to learn them. And the things I've struggled most in my life to learn are things that I couldn't really connect to other bits of knowledge in meaningful ways. Like one of the subjects I struggled with most in school, and school, I was generally good at school, but one of the subjects I did relatively poorly in was chemistry.
Interesting.
Because it just felt like this whole disconnected layer of the world where all of a sudden you're just trying to describe things in this weird, abstract way that is so hard for me to actually connect in other ways. And actually, since being in high school, I have watched some chemistry YouTubers or whatever and feel like I've actually started to integrate more chemistry knowledge into my theory of everything. But that was an example of a thing someone tried to teach me that and I was like, okay, I can't connect this to other stuff.
Interesting. That's surprising to me because I feel like chemistry is one of those things that is most interconnected. The subject I really struggled with was history because of the way that it was taught to me. I grew up in the South, in Atlanta, Georgia, just for context, maybe. But history was very much taught to me in this, it's a series of dates and a series of men, and specifically men doing things and fighting wars. And all of these things felt totally disconnected, and I couldn't just, memorize these dates. And I've been learning a lot more history lately through, things like you mentioned, the book COD, which is a history, but told through the story of resources. And it's like, oh, this actually makes so much more sense now. And I can get my mind around it and remember it because there's actually a compelling narrative to the way that we exploited these resources for 400 years.
Maybe we just had bad teachers in our respective subjects.
I definitely had bad teachers in history, for sure.
Because history is one of the things I feel like is the easiest for me to, take any historical event and I can plug it in my mind into what was going on in the parts of the world I do know things about in that time, and it almost always connects in some meaningful way. Like, it's so easy to tie that into the tapestry of everything. But maybe it's just a matter of having bad teachers. I don't know.
Yeah, teachers are important. I had really good chemistry teachers that were... It was very funny how frustrated they were with their students. I'll never forget.
A good teacher should be frustrated.
I forget his name actually now, but just
I'll never
at some
forget.
point
I forget his name.
He was just so overwhelmed by how much his students didn't care, and he just like leaned over and just started screaming into the sink. It was all he could do.
I have a memory like that from high school, which was an English teacher I had.
But the history teachers were screaming at me directly, which was much, much worse. So I appreciate the chemistry teacher.
Not great. I had an English teacher once who was so distraught by our apparent lack of interest in literature that she asked the class, she like got really frustrated, and she was just like, do any of you know why I'm an English teacher? Like, take a guess. And we were like, you like writing? And she was like, no. And we had no more guesses. And she was like, I like reading! I love books and literature! She was so mad at us for not caring about whatever book we were assigned.
Yeah.
And then none of us could imagine why she liked English, because we were so disinterested in the book we were assigned.
It's like, it could not occur to you that somebody could enjoy reading.
Oh, you like the book so much that you made it your job? Weird.
Books can be your job? What's her job, though? It's books. Don't worry about
She was so distraught. Shout out to Mrs. Crowell. Sorry, Mrs. Crowell. It was just the context in which we were assigned the books, and also the books themselves. Anyway, I want to talk about architecture today, Anthony.
Okay.
Because in my generalist theory of everything approach to life and how I understand the world, I am oftentimes thinking about other creative practices relative to cube design, which is one of my most creative practices these days, is designing cubes, what we talk about in the show all the time. And I think it might be interesting to talk about how other creative practices and the things we know about them or understand about them could relate to or inform cube design in an abstract sense. I also hope maybe this is more interesting for you to talk about because it's just a big thing about the world and not about magic specifically, but we can tie it to the part of magic we care about.
I mean, yeah, I love tying magic to other things because it's all about the interfaces and the connections between...
It's about the relationships.
It's about the relationships.
This to this. No one's going to get that at all.
Oh, the one person that was in that college class with us who listens to this podcast will get it.
Yeah. So anyway, architecture is the thing I think about a lot, and there's actually a portion of my life where I really wanted to be an architect. I love the design of things. I've always been interested in design in like the broadest sense. And I think buildings are very compelling because, well, first of all, they obviously have a huge impact on the quality of our lives, right? Like what your life is like, the texture of your life is massively dominated by the home you live in, the neighborhood in which you live, the city in which you live, the building you have to go to work in or whatever. So it's like a type of design that has a huge impact on people's lives. It's also a type of design that is like fundamentally very practical, right? Like I studied graphic design in college, which is the least practical of all the designs that I'm aware of, at least. You just draw pictures on things to make marketing better for companies, basically. And I've often felt like the design practices that are closer to practical considerations are more in line with my values. They're dictated systematically by things that are more close to what I care about.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about art today, like most people, just that conjures to their mind a picture of a painting or a sculpture, and it's like just these decorative objects that you can put on a wall. But the wall itself is also a work of art, and
I think a much more interesting work of art.
Absolutely right. It's an interesting work of art because it has specific needs and specific constraints that change dramatically based on the needs of the particular structure, the materials that are available near it, the climate that it's in, and sort of trying to solve these problems in a way that is creative and satisfies these needs and is also creating an environment that is nice to live in is, yeah, I mean, it's a really compelling and obviously really important art form.
So yeah, I wanted to be an architect at some point, and I don't have to get into a lot of detail about why I didn't end up becoming an architect, but a lot of it comes down to having conversations with architects. My first job in graphic design was for a graphic design agency that was founded by two architects, or former architects, I guess, who were both very jaded about the state of modern architecture. Not the actual buildings themselves per se, but the creative practice. Like, what it meant to be an architect to them was very bleak. Specifically, it was like, they had jobs for years where they got paid to submit proposals and make models and, renderings of designs they had created. But just, so rarely did a building they designed get built. It just wasn't a thing that happened very often. And so they felt like they were not actually doing the work they wanted to do. And they were drawn to graphic design because of the immediacy and the real impact. Somewhat ironically, I said it was like the least practical kind of design, but for them it was like you design a thing, you print it out, and then it's done. It's real, and you get to put it somewhere and have an effect on somebody. Whereas, the timeline for architecture is, many years in most cases, if it even gets built at all. Plus, I didn't really like school that much, and it was going to involve a lot more school. So anyway, I remain basically a fan of architecture, an enthusiast of architecture, and your point about the wall being a piece of art. Like, when I travel, that is what I mostly want to see, is buildings, right? Like, the idea of going...
I mean, you were in Switzerland, and the one thing you sent me a picture of was literally a guy building a wall, and you were like a little stone wall. And you're like, look what a nice job they're doing of this wall.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think the buildings are so much more interesting than, I oftentimes will not be that interested in, going to the art museum in whatever city we're in. And I care about art. We've talked about art history at length. I studied it in school. I like art. But to me, looking at a painting in person is not that different than looking at a picture of it. I mean, obviously, in some cases, depending on the type of painting or type of visual art, actually being in front of it, it does make a big difference. But compared to a building, looking at a picture of a building, to me, always pales in comparison to actually, walking around it yourself and, being in the space in which it was built and, understanding that viscerally. So I'm always looking for buildings more than art.
More than art?
Okay, art is everything. Who cares? Before I get into the broad history of architecture from my perspective, a couple of things about architecture obviously seem to be shared with game design or cube design to me. And one of them is that architecture is inherently an assemblage of stuff, right? Like, a building consists of many constituent parts, and especially the further you go back in time and history, a bunch of pre-existing things, right? You're taking a bunch of logs and you're making them into a cabin. You're taking a bunch of rocks and you're building them into a masonry structure. You're combining things that exist to make them new and meaningful in context with each other. Is that too abstract and touchy-feely? You put a bunch of rocks into a shape that now it's meaningfully a building, compared to you put a bunch of cards into a shape that now it's meaningfully a game experience?
No, I mean, I want to get even more abstract with it. I'm thinking about, architecture has real constraints in terms of you need to build a structure that serves a particular purpose, and games, or maybe just, play more broadly, also it does serve a specific purpose, and it needs certain components to work, but it's almost like this mental architecture of where is this space that we're going to exist and play and explore ideas together in games. Is that too abstract?
No, it's kind of the next thing I was going to say, is that to me, the first thing that they have in common is this assemblage of parts, right? You don't sit down and make a building out of nothing. You have to take a bunch of stuff and then recombine it meaningfully, in the same way that you don't sit down and make a cube out of nothing. The next thing I was going to say is that it's not that game design is practical in the same way, right? Because it's inherently playing a game is inherently a luxury of society, where if you have all of your Maslow's hierarchy of needs met, then you get to play a game, right? In some ways it's not practical at all in that sense. But compared to more superficial or ornamental design or art or creative practices, games have interaction points, right? They have mechanics in the same way that the physical world has mechanics, and you are designing not a thing to be looked at, but a thing to be interacted with. And that's how I think about buildings as well as games, right? The same way you decide where you put doors, that is going to dictate how people actually interact with this assemblage of stuff. The same way that whatever cards you put in a cube or whatever, components you put in a game is going to dictate how people are going to interact with those components.
I mean, I would just push back on the part that it is purely this luxury thing that happens once all other needs are met. I mean, I feel like if you look at children or even baby animals, they need to play. Play is fundamental to them practicing the things that we'll experience in their adult life. I mean, I'm just thinking back to, at some point I was traveling in Italy and we were in this old cave that was a tannery, and it was actually wild. It still stank from like it hadn't
cave
been
and
used.
a tannery.
A cave that had been a tannery, and so there was these big sort of wells that had been carved out where they would tan hides, and then there's sort of this in the corner, some like overturned block. And I look at it, everybody else is like, oh, you know, this is so cool. This is where they tan the hides. And I'm like, yo, people. And on this rock was carved a very familiar shape that was a square with a square inside and a square inside, and then lines connecting the squares. And I'm like, this is...
A cube? You described a drawing of a cube.
It's a drawing of a... No, I mean, it was carved on a marble cube, but it's like, no, this is a game board. Like, this is used for playing. And it's like, even in this place that it's impossible to imagine anything but like this really difficult, hard work, there needed to be some element of play for these humans to stay sane people.
What was the game?
What is the name of this game?
I'm trying to picture the board you described, and you were like a square and another square and some lines.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good.
Which is why I said a cube, because that's, you know, if you're drawing a cube, you just draw two offset squares and connect the corners. Italian rock game cave.
Nine Men's Mills. I think it goes by a whole bunch of games, but here, even it says on the internet, goes back to at least the Roman Empire, so fits with my experience.
Yeah, I guess I'm not saying that play is not important in any way, but I guess that's an interesting question. Like, games that are that old are purely like a emergent cultural tradition, right? Like, there was nobody for whom society had decided you should be a game designer and like make stuff for us to play with. It was like games just kind of emerged through organic play and then became codified over time, I imagine.
I mean, I'm sure there was a culture, and it's fascinating to, like, the game is this idea, and if you have played it before and you have, a chisel, you can carve shapes into a flat rock and some pebbles of different colors, you can recreate this game. And I think that sort of, like, cultural evolution was really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm wildly speculating at this point, but if this fits in with my understanding of how the rest of the things I do know about the world work, then I imagine games prior to like the Renaissance would not be credited to a person. It's
right.
Not like somebody designed this. It's like, no, this emerged over time and was like hewn by generations of people that just, you know, did this because their parents did this, and then like it kind of was passed down. But to go back to like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs thing, like people did not have the luxury to be a game designer in this era. It was like a thing that happened naturally because it was a human urge.
I mean,
or a human...
what era are we talking about? Because there's been a lot of luxury in many different eras. Not equitably distributed luxury, but there's always some people.
I guess I was talking about the era of whatever tanning cave you're talking about here. Yeah, obviously there were people that, you know, lived that had their full
Italy
hierarchy
and the,
of
like,
needs
late
met.
Roman Empire.
Yeah, obviously there were like, you know, people that had all that were at the peak of society at that point that had all their needs met.
You don't think Nero had his on-staff game designer?
No, I genuinely don't think so. I mean, it's possible, but
I bet he did. Dude loved to have a good time.
I really doubt it. I mean, now I got to look up the like deep history. I feel like if you look up game design, it's going to be like, oh, well, for a long time there was Go and chess and stuff, and then eventually. Well, let's talk more about architecture.
Okay.
I don't know as much about the history of game design, and I'm just like I'm wildly speculating here. But I do know more about architecture. So those are the things that I see shared between architecture and game design, cube design. You're taking an assemblage of existing things, recombining them to make them meaningful in different ways, and also your design decisions are dictating avenues of interaction. They're dictating behaviors. You're basically telling people to do things through your creative choices. You know, you put a door here, people are going to walk through it. You put a chair in front of a window, people are going to sit in it or whatever. You put certain cards in a cube, you make certain choices in game design, and it's going to dictate what people take in a draft, what card they're going to cast, that kind of stuff. Let's talk briefly about like Andy's history of architecture. And I say Andy's because this is just whatever stuck in my head from all the books I've read and stuff that I've done. It's not comprehensive. It's going to be very biased. And if you know more about architectural history than I do, please sound off in the comments if I have misrepresented anything. My vague understanding of like the big major eras of architecture are like going all the way back to prehistory. We have vernacular architecture. This is just untrained people making buildings purely for practical purposes, basically. You need a shelter because it's going to rain or the sun's going to come out or it's going to get cold. So you take whatever's around you and you make a shelter out of it. And you are not a trained architect. You are not even necessarily a craftsperson. You are just somebody that is taking things from the world and reorganizing them in a way that suits your needs. this is, I think, the most like emergent form of building design. I mean, the buildings you could say are designed, they're just not designed in like a conscious top-down sense. They're designed by context, right? You mentioned before, like cultural context, climate context, availability of materials, like those things all contributed to this emergent design of what various dwellings looked like all over the world. And they differ dramatically, right? Dwellings in the American Southwest versus dwellings in Asia and dwellings in Siberia. Like they were all dramatically different depending on those local contexts. But you can look at the resulting building and talk about it from a design sensibility sense. It's just that those resulting decisions are all, again, emergent from what was on hand, very bottom up. As society evolves and we generally get better at doing stuff, you start to move into an era of like craftspeople, where now instead of people being responsible for building their own dwellings and structures, you have people that are somewhat trained, that are specialists, that are doing something on a more broad scale. So you have masons, you have carpenters or timber framers. Carpentry is actually... You have people working with wood.
You're worried about some carpenters getting upset?
Well, no, I think the non-carpenters, you have people working with wood that are specialists in that material that are doing those things. You have people that are,
brick makers.
Sure. Craft people that are doing a thing repeatedly and the scale is increasing, and the slight specialization of having like some people that are glaziers that can make windows versus people that can do the masonry versus people that can do the carpentry means that buildings get more complicated, they get more sophisticated, and they get larger, and they just get more, right? There's just more of it going on. But to me, this is still like, in broad strokes, very similar to vernacular architecture in the sense that it's just that, but kind of like turned up, right? You're still very much bottom up, right? Like the mason is like going to use the tools of the mason and their practice, and they're going to get better at laying stones or bricks, and they're going to, be able to do it with some degree of craft and care and maybe beauty, but you're still basically working from the bottom up in the sense that you have a cultural tradition of a certain type of building that was taught to you by your mason, mentor. You were an apprentice to some mason, or you were an apprentice to some roofer or whatever, and this like cultural tradition is still passed down, and then the resulting buildings that you end up building are again a result of all this cultural inertia, which goes back in its roots to those days of vernacular architecture of whatever you happen to have around, right? Like, and this goes all the way, like, I'm talking about buildings all the way through, like, the classical era, like, a lot of, like, the oldest buildings in Europe I'm still talking about here, like...
I mean, is it maybe relevant to say that my impression is basically, let's say, pre-industrial revolution...
Oh, we're still very pre-industrial revolution here.
The people, even maybe up until then, it feels like the people that were designing the buildings, that were making the choice about what the buildings look like, were also very much on site and had a hand in making it.
I'm still at the point where, like, we don't even have architects or designers attributed to any buildings prior to, like, the Renaissance. There was nobody that made the decisions about the buildings. It was a collective effort of, like, well, the church says they want a big building to do this with these needs. The people are going to, like, make vague plans, but then a lot of people are making decisions like, yeah, the tradespeople, the people with the actual skills are making a lot of the decisions around, like, what the building actually results in. Or if there is somebody who is like in charge and like making design decisions, we don't think about it in a design sense. We don't think to credit that person. It's not like they are a creative individual that is being valued by society. It's like, no, they're just doing a thing that needs to be done. And the buildings we have from this era, right? Like there's tons of old dwellings, right? From antiquity or from, hundreds or thousands of years ago that are kind of unremarkable to most people. It's like, oh, it's just an old building or whatever. The buildings that people think about most are like the big giant structures, which are churches. Basically, it's churches. I mean, if you go back prior to the Enlightenment, basically, or even a lot post the Enlightenment, the only organization that would have the resources to make a big structure was the church or the state. And so you have big state buildings and you have big churches. There was no other reason to build a massive structure with more ambition than just practicality, right? And we never talk about religion on the show for good reason. This is not a show about religion. I'm not a religious person. You're not a religious person. And I'm often very cynical about the role that religion has played in the history of society. But this is one very bright example where, for a long time, the only reason that people would go like above and beyond and like try and make something beautiful in like a big societal sense was because of some sense of obligation to a larger being, right? I am glad that we have all of these big, beautiful churches, even though I am not a religious person and don't love...
Love a BBC.
I love a BBC. Real quick here from the editing booth, I keep saying church, and what I mean, of course, is just religious structure. This, of course, applies to temples, mosques, other religious buildings all over the world, not just churches in the Christian tradition. Buildings for religious congregation of any affiliation. I think it is, here's what I'll say. I think it is beautiful that people felt a calling to make something beautiful and ambitious, and they found that calling in a different place than I would find it, but I'm glad that we have these things as the artifacts of humans just reaching beyond pure practicality. And in a broad sense, it's kind of a shame that there was no other, like, people couldn't see a reason to be more ambitious except for to imagine there's a guy living in the sky who tells them to do something great. But regardless, that's why we have these buildings.
Yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying, and I don't want to disrupt your narrative, but I also do just want to push back a little bit and say I'm confident that people were finding other reasons to go above and beyond to do beautiful things for each other.
Where are the buildings, baby?
Well, that's exactly why I love sort of that moment of seeing that game in that cave and thinking like, oh yeah, we're all here talking about this big church, and this is what people think of as Roman history. But really, it's like underfoot is this rock that says so much about the people that were really here and the kinds of things that they were creating for themselves and for each other. And to me, it's like there's so much that we just don't know about the everyday stuff. And I'm sure that there was so much beauty that people created for each other.
No,
but not
for sure.
so much in architecture, because that does take a big collective effort when
right.
you're moving beyond a building that can house one person.
And that's what I'm talking about, right? Like, look, trust me, I'm the guy that also finds more beauty in like the little old dwelling than in the giant church in a lot of ways. But it's also nice that people were like building a big communal building that was trying to be beautiful, that was trying to answer a higher calling than just, you know, whatever parochial need that someone had at the current time. And it just happens to be that was almost entirely, again, church and state. Those are the two things. Like some governments...
Often they were not two things, actually.
Well, no, they were often the same thing. But, you know, some polities and city-states would make giant buildings as testaments to their greatness. But for the most part, if you look at, you know, the buildings that you can say thousands and thousands of hours of human effort with artistic intent, like, I want this to be beautiful, went into this, it's almost always because of religious reasons when you look through history. But anyway, this is all still like a very clear through line to me in my head. It's like, all right, well, we are building buildings of what we have available to us. Then we got a little better at it. You know, we got a little better at building buildings of what was available to us. But still, like, again, the buildings we're building are reflecting the cultural values. It's big churches, big state buildings. And the creative decisions are largely being made by craftspeople that are working with the materials directly. It's still a very, like, direct relationship between things. The Renaissance comes along, and oof, I'm self-conscious and back in the editing booth. This is what happens when I do an episode that's all about a thing that I'm just kind of talking about off the cuff that I care deeply about. What I was trying to say about the Renaissance here that I didn't really explain that well is that the Renaissance is stylistically largely a revival of past styles. It's a revival of classical styles from ancient Greek and Roman architecture. But the main difference here is the relationship between designer and building, because what we see in the Renaissance is this elevation of the individual creative person as a entity to be valued, and buildings start to be attributed to individual designers. I'm about to read a bit of Wikipedia here to Anthony, which will say this better than I will say it here. But what we see is basically designers using these styles that emerged naturally from context through the history of vernacular architecture and now applying them consciously in the role of an artist, in the role of a creative decision maker. And I kind of think that's where a lot of cube design is right now. We have cube designers that are approaching a cube design as a creative project. They're making creative decisions surrounding it, and they're doing it by riffing on or recreating emergent patterns from Magic more broadly. And of course, Magic has its own designers, and that's something that makes this a little complicated. But if you think of cube design as pure game design, you're sitting down and you're trying to make a game using patterns that have developed in contexts and reapplying them and remixing them in novel ways, rather than creating something fully from scratch or more radically. So what I originally said here is that I think a lot of people with untrained eyes or not knowing the eras in which buildings were built might struggle to differentiate Renaissance architecture, broadly speaking, from classical architecture, other neoclassical architecture, maybe even some Gothic buildings. Because superficially, there's not this really strong through line of design aesthetically that is going to tie everything together. At least to me, the bigger difference is the changing relationship, again, between the designer and the creative output, rather than these buildings growing naturally from the cultural context in which they were created and the traditions of the craftspeople that built them. They're being consciously designed, consciously planned and designed by people given credit for their design, oftentimes singular people, singular architects or artisans. Now onto the bit of Wikipedia I read to Anthony, and on with the episode. There's actually, I'm going to do one little bit of reading Wikipedia here, just because I think this little paragraph does a better job at saying the thing I want to express.
That's how you know it's a podcast.
In Renaissance Europe, from about 1400 onwards, there was a revival of classical learning accompanied by the development of Renaissance humanism, which placed greater emphasis on the role of the individual in society than had been the case during the medieval period. Buildings were ascribed to specific architects: Brunelleschi, Alberti, Michelangelo, Palladio, and the cult of the individual had begun. There was still no dividing line between artist, architect, and engineer, or any of the related vocations, and the appellation was often one of regional preference. A revival of the classical style in architecture was accompanied by a burgeoning of science and engineering which affected proportions and structure of buildings. At this stage, it was still possible for an artist to design a bridge, as the level of structural calculations involved was within the scope of the generalist. So, we start to actually begin to recognize, like, this artist, again, they say here exactly artist, architect, engineer, they all kind of meant the same thing. It just was a matter of where you were, whether they called people designing buildings artists, architects, or engineers. They were still capable of, like, doing everything themselves, right? Like, they could still do the math for a bridge because there wasn't that much complicated math involved. We hadn't gotten to the degree of specialization that was focused enough that no one person could actually contain all of the knowledge to understand every step of the process.
Sure. So the difference is, like, I, as an individual, if I gave myself enough time, could take a hand axe, go out, cut down a tree, hew some timbers, and figure out how to make a basic wooden bridge. If you tell me, build this steel cable suspension bridge, no chance. Like, it's no amount of time could make that happen.
Well, not just you, but, like, no human being on planet Earth
yeah.
contains all of the skills to make the steel suspension cables, do the math to actually make sure the bridge stands up. Like, it's just... There's that famous TED talk about how nobody knows how to make a computer mouse. Like, all of the things that go into making a computer.
I'm like thinking through, like, I know a little bit about math for bridges. I know, depending on if we put the weight in the cable versus the weight in the bridge, we have a parabola or a catenary, and it ends up being somewhere in between, and you figure out the distributions. And steel cables, you make some steel, that part's easy, right? And then stretch it out. Like, I can kind of tease apart
that part's
the bits.
Easy.
But then, you say a computer mouse, it's like, oh, yeah, nope. No way.
There's also that book where somebody made a toaster from scratch.
It was a very, very bad toaster. Like,
terrible
just
toaster.
Don't get your hopes up.
Where they actually, mined ore from the earth and, like, refined it into metal to make a coil. They tried to make, like, the world's simplest appliance from scratch, and they kind of succeeded, but it's a disaster. It's really ugly. Yeah, I mean, we're getting to this step, but we're not there yet, right? We are still pre-Industrial Revolution. We are pre-Modernism. And in the Renaissance, we started to, like, ascribe more value to people's creative input, right? Like, it was no longer like, well, yeah, the foreman for the church decided where these rooms went, and, like, we all just kind of did it. Now we're starting to recognize that that person is making decisions with creative value. But overall, the, like, nature of the buildings has not radically changed, right? This has kind of been like a ramping up of, like, we got better at our understanding of materials, we got better at craft, and broadly speaking, society allowed for more time and resources to, like, go into putting a building together. But no insanely radical shifts, again, from Andy's, perspective of the history of architecture that is, like, stuck in his brain. And then we do get to the Industrial Revolution and modernism. And this is where there is a wild, like, almost overnight sea change in what architecture is. This is where we, like, get the idea of an architect as distinct from an artist and engineer, the things we described in the Renaissance, where this massive explosion in our technical ability to manipulate materials, to modify the world around us, means that you can do architecture in a totally different way that I think is like a direct parallel to top-down design. You basically get to say, I'm going to draw a shape of a building, and then we're going to figure out how to make it, right? I'm not working from, I have these rocks, and I have to like turn them into something meaningful. I am working from a blank slate. Let me like design a building, and then the whole thrust of modern technical innovation will bear down on making that a reality. A skyscraper, meaning a building above like 15 stories, is very much a like byproduct of technology. People might not realize you can't just keep stacking rocks up in the same way above a certain height and keep making a building taller.
Well, you can, but you have to make it very wide at the bottom.
Yes, you can make it very wide at the bottom. That's true. That will work.
See? Pyramids.
There's a famous anecdote about the first engineer that made a building taller than, I want to say it was like 15 stories. I forget where there was like a line in New York City where like they just didn't have the technology to build a building taller and have it be like structurally sound. And then this guy came along and was like, what if we basically turn a bridge vertical and we like take all of the like ideas we have around how to make a bridge structurally sound across like a horizontal expanse and just make it, straight up and down, and basically like build a taller building. And everyone was like, well, that's going to fall down. Like, what an idiot. And then he like went up and like stood on a top floor like in a storm, and everyone came out to the street to watch this guy die, and then the building didn't fall down, and then thus the skyscraper was born. We realized we could actually build buildings that were taller. But this like fundamental change in technology and how we think about the world, which also involves way more radical specialization, right? Like now we're at the era where you're not just taking a rock, you're smelting iron ore and making it into like giant beams and doing whatever you want with that, or making huge, expanses of glass plates that, before you could never make by traditional methods, but now you can with this like big industrial methods. And you get modern architecture. You and I both have an interesting direct relationship with modern architecture because of where we went to college. We studied at a school called MICA in Baltimore, the Maryland Institute College of Art, which has
buildings, unlike most colleges.
Well, no, I mean, every college has buildings, but I think MICA's campus is it's a really unique spread of buildings. It's a small campus, it's a small school, and it's like very much, enmeshed with the like, there's no borders to the campus. It's like, part of the texture of the city. It's just like, buildings among other city buildings and homes. And there's a couple fairly old buildings that are on campus that are actually built in like a neoclassical style. They're built to look even older than they are. They're built to look like, old Roman or, Greek buildings with like the big columns and like marble everywhere and the expansive stairways and everything. And then there are a couple of like very mundane, like almost industrial buildings that have been like turned into artist studios or offices that are just, the classic brick rectangle with windows and stuff. But then there are a number of very bold, very unique modern buildings that were built on campus specifically by the school with the idea of like demonstrating to the outside world that MICA was a forward-facing institution. This is not just a stuffy place where people come and learn how to paint still lives and nudes. This is a place where you can be on the cutting edge of art and design and technology, and like, it's a marketing tactic basically for the school. So, and you can tell from how all of the marketing materials, the photos of campus that are used on the posters and website and things for admissions are all like highlighting these like new fancy buildings.
Yeah, I mean, and more than that, highlighting the contrast of like, here is the neoclassical marble building in the background and this big glass wedge in the foreground. And that's sort of like trying to demonstrate a spanning of time and a roundedness.
Yeah, it's actually like, I think, a very beautiful idea. The idea that the campus consists of all these different buildings and they're in close proximity to each other, yeah, I think is meant to tell a story about the types of values of the institution. And I think it does a pretty compelling job. I think we've actually also told this anecdote on the show ages ago. I have a weird memory of telling a very similar anecdote. So if you've already heard this, you're one of the OGs. And I remember coming to campus to tour MICA before I applied, and me and my family being in awe of this one building, right? And this was, since then, there have been even more modern buildings built on campus, but when I was, applying to attend in 2007 or whatever, The building that I'm talking about is the Brown Center. We'll put a link in the show notes to this building. You can go look at it if you want. And
designed by architects Zeiger Sneed.
Yeah, and it looks like a giant iceberg, right? It's like a very pointy building, like it's all glass on the outside. It's not a normal shape in any sense. And it's like at night it...
Whoa. Are we the people to judge what a shape is a normal shape? Not a normal shape for a building.
Does it have a name, the shape?
Yes, it's a shard.
No, I'm saying it doesn't have...
berg.
It's not a... It is not an...
It's an irregular polyhedron.
It's not a platonic solid. It's like, it's just a polyhedron of a shape or whatever. And it like, it's all glass, so it like glows at night when all the lights are on. It's this like big kind of like glowing gem, basically. And I remember looking at the building and being like, this is amazing. What a beautiful building. And it was the building that my intended major was in. And I remember applying to the school and thinking, I will get to be in this amazing building studying graphic design. I had the thought that I'm sure that the admissions team and the leadership team at MICA wanted me to have exactly when they built that building. They wanted a student to come to campus and go, this is a beautiful building, and being here to like study this thing that I love is a very compelling idea. And then you get to MICA, you go through your first year of foundation classes, and you get your first couple classes in the Brown Center, this beautiful building you've talked about forever. And this building sucks. This building is awful. It is a terrible building. Just practically, the way that it actually works is, I think, a huge disappointment. It's near impossible to keep a reasonable temperature. It's famous for in the summer being ice cold and in the winter being super warm. And it like the temperature varies dramatically on different floors because it has this big open plan and there's no way to actually like isolate a floor and make it a different temperature because it's all connected to the rest of the building. All of the actual classrooms, with only a few exceptions, are entirely internal rooms with no windows because...
Well, they wanted the building to glow, so that hallways had to be on the outside.
Exactly. They wanted the building to glow, and they wanted it to look like it was bustling, and so the hallways are what is on the outside of almost the entire building, and the actual classrooms are just like 3 sides, just, drywall, and then you have one wall that opens to a hallway that has some glass on the outside. So you kind of have one wall of a little bit of natural light. But just depressing little rooms that, by the way, are not rectangles.
They're not square.
They're not rectangles at all.
Not a 90-degree angle to be found.
No 90-degree angles in the building, basically, which means that the furniture all fits in awkward, terrible ways. It's just, like, really awkward to have a room with a projector in it where you can, like, have some students watching a presentation.
Yeah, it turns out 2 things that are built with the assumption of square rooms are tables and projectors.
Well, it's just, like, every, like, practical aspect of this building, it just seems like... I mean...
It leaks. It's difficult to repair.
It leaks a lot. It's really expensive to repair. Also, like, you build a big glass building in a city where there's a conflicted relationship between the school attended by super wealthy students from all over the world and the, like, local community, which is nowhere near as wealthy. And so, yeah, people are going to throw rocks through the windows sometimes.
Glasses for breaking.
So it's, like, just really interesting to me that this building does such a good job at... this like superficial thing, which is an important part of why it was built, right? Like, I don't think you can look at this building and call it a total failure because I had that experience in 2007 or 2006, whatever, when I came to the campus and thought like, this is a beautiful, amazing place that I want to be. And then the actual practicalities of coming to that building every single day or, 4 days a week for classes for 3 years just made me hate it. I was like, this building is just awful. And I think a lot of modern architecture, and modern means 2 different things here. Like, there's some modernity in the sense of like after this explosion of technology, and to be clear, like the mundane rectangular industrial building is very much part of modern architecture in that sense. And then there's modern architecture as it relates to like modernism in art, and that's where you get these very experimental out there buildings that are largely disconnected from the whole cultural history of architecture up until that point, right? Like, they sat down and drew a shape on a piece of paper and said, now we will use the power of steel and glass to make this shape. And we'll pour concrete in exactly the shapes we need inside for all the stairs and everything. Like, it was very top down, which, I think directly connects to the idea of like top-down game design, right? If you're working on a cube in an emergent sense and you're saying, I have some cards I like and I want to play with them and I'm going to like put them together and build a cube the way that somebody builds a dwelling for themselves, or the way that a family or a small community would like build a structure, it's very emergent and you end up with a certain set of choices, aesthetic values that are evidenced through that. And then when you work top down, you kind of throw a lot of that out the window in favor of a vision, right? Like a high level idea that's going to dictate these things instead of an emergent ground up approach. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that like top down design is bad and like emergent design is better.
It does sound like you're saying that.
I'm not at all. And there are some modern buildings that I adore. I think some modern architecture is a huge success, right? It's just that when you have taken the actual design of the building and broken it up into so many specialized jobs, and one of those jobs is the person that designs it, and then everybody else is like kind of executing it to some degree, you end up with way more variability. And the most beautiful buildings in the world, I think, are probably made this way. I think some of the most like successful buildings that meet all of the goals of the designers and architects and inhabitants are built in this manner. And also some of the biggest disappointments are built in this manner. Meanwhile, when you go back to the era of like craftspeople, there is way less range in what a building could be, right? It's like your building couldn't be so terrible and it couldn't be so incredible because there was just a much narrower range of what was possible. What I really wanted to get at here, like the nut of my point here, is that there is a value placed on design with a capital D in a top-down sense, I think, societally. Like, we don't think of these old buildings as having designers because the designers were, again, these craftspeople working directly with materials from the ground up. They were making decisions on the fly or based on some inherited cultural tradition. Prior to the Renaissance, there was no value placed on that. It wasn't like there was a designer of a building even, or a designer of a game. These things just kind of happened, emergent in society. And then when we developed the ideas and the technology to like separate these tasks, now we like vaulted the idea of a designer up to this like high level, which is only to say that I think a lot of would-be cube designers think they have to be a designer in that second sense. They think what it means to be a designer is to have a top-down vision. They would think what it means to be an architect is to like be able to take a piece of paper and draw the building you want built from all the different angles and elevations. Like that is what design is to a lot of people. They don't think of that more emergent, ground-up, like crafts-based approach as design.
Vernacular cube design or vernacular game design.
Yeah, I mean, almost. I don't want to stretch this analogy too much because obviously huge differences between these things. But again, like this is how my brain works, right? Like I think that there are a lot of similarities in the way that humans approach a creative task. And the thing that I want to emphasize here is that like we have been huge proponents of what we've called emergent cube design in the past, which is basically just take cards you like and put them in a pile and, make a couple of concessions to curve or density of removal and then just like start playing with them and then just iterate over time and make improvements based on what you like and don't like. And it only really occurred to me when I started thinking about this specific topic that I think a lot of people just don't think of that as design. They don't think that they're designing because of this modernist sensibility we have that design is a top-down thing. One of the other things that kept me from pursuing architecture more seriously is there have been a number of times where talking to my friends that have been architects or engineers or talking with friends that have commissioned buildings from architecture firms and builders, there is a huge tension today in 2024 between architects and builders, between architecture firms that are the ones that are doing the top-down design for the most part. And again, every firm's going to operate differently. There's going to be variety here, but I have seen on multiple instances this tension between people that are designing this idealized thing and then the people that have to actually execute it and make it real, because there is a disconnect fundamentally in the world in how we've organized these practices for the most part between those tasks. And I did not want to be somebody living in a like bubble where I was only superficially aware of material constraints and engineering concerns and the practicalities of what it would take to actually bring something to life. And I was instead just kind of drawing pictures of idealized things and hoping that, somehow everything would come together and make it happen. And there are specifically architecture firms that are design build firms that are trying to solve this problem, that are trying to not be this. They design and build their own designs because they want that connection between these things. But it's a choice you have to make consciously because naturally what has happened as a result of modernism and the Industrial Revolution is this like hyper specialization of things being totally separated.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to recognize that there is a lot of value in that specialization, and we can't create the kinds of things we can make without that specialization. But it also comes with this fundamental risk of
I like having a computer
disconnection
mouse.
of things not working because of the like lack of, or just the risk of having more moving parts in something being made. And I agree with you that even within that system, you can still do a good job of it. One example that I am fascinated by is Gaudi, who made these like totally insane looking things that feel like they would be impossible to build. And in many ways they were. They're like really hard to build. But he was very much engaged with the fundamentals of the materials. There's some like really, really cool images I've seen of him just taking strings and weights and observing the way that weight distribution actually works. And I'm just, catenaries are stuck in my brain right now, but actually sort of using the fundamentals of the materials in these models to design a thing that looks very organic and is, because it's actually based on these like mechanical principles that he was playing out, not writing math equations, but just seeing how these materials worked in these models. And when you're designing the Brown Center and you're just like, what if we made it these cubes? Like, how much can we cantilever this before it breaks? I don't know. Let's let the engineers figure that out. It's just not having that same sense of collaboration with the materials and collaboration between the different specializations.
Yeah. So anyway, a cube is like a building.
A cube is
a cube is a building, and a building is a cube. Really makes you think. So I guess in summary, like the things I wanted to touch on are, I think, what game design or cube design can take from architecture is, one, recognizing that the fundamental task of both of these things is to like assemble and recombine existing things in a new context that makes them meaningful. Recognize that, you know, your game design is not starting from a total blank slate. You are taking stuff that exists and recontextualizing it and recombining it in a meaningful way. Recognizing that the main creative lever you have to pull, like the main expression of your creative decisions, is behavior, not something more superficial. Again, like I love visual art, I love fine art, as it were, and there's so much to be said for like making a painting or a sculpture that will make somebody feel something or think something, but there is a big difference there between making somebody think and feel something and making somebody do something, or, you know, making somebody feel something because they did something, not because they just looked at a thing. Making somebody feel awe because of the way you design the entrance into your cathedral or whatever is a different set of mechanics than making somebody feel awe because you painted something beautiful. So recognizing that our main creative tool is those behaviors, I think is important. And this is not to like discount or denigrate a cube who is not focused on those behaviors, those interactions. Like, you know, you could have a cube that's designed around cards with alliteration in their name or cards with people sitting in chairs in the art if you wanted to, but recognizing that's what you're doing in those cases and that you're making decisions in a different context than, you know, the average game design, which is, again, all about those behaviors. I think that's something else we can take from architecture. And then the last thing for me is just this idea that, at least in like the Western world or whatever, I think it's important to recognize that the word designer has a lot of baggage associated with modernity and this idea that a designer works in a particular way and has a vision and functions in a certain way related to the creative task, and recognizing that there is no inherent value in designing, especially a building or a game, that way, and you can instead design a building or a game from a much more grassroots, ground-up perspective and have it be just as beautiful, just as successful as something designed in the other method. That was a really long and probably not very focused summary. I was trying to summarize the points, and I feel like I just blabbered on for another 5 minutes.
Yeah, people can work through it.
Anyway, everything is exactly the same. A building is a cube. Next time, Anthony, you're going to have to spend an hour talking about how a cube is just like cooking. This is your job.
Okay.
I believe in you.
I can certainly talk about cooking for an hour.
You can.
No problem.
Do it. Well, I guess that's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for tuning in. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by Anthony and I, thinking really hard about magic cards and architecture, and then speaking into microphones about it. Thanks, bud.
Thank you. Now it's time to go sit at a computer all day.
Love to sit at computer. We're so close to the material of our job. We get to touch the computer every day.
Touch the JavaScript, really get your hands in there, feel the texture of it,
feel those
how
functions,
feel the way it behaves.
I mean, boy, this is a whole big... I actually think a lot of the tools that have been developed to make software development more easier and more fun are basically that. TypeScript and like typed programming languages, like you type a thing and it shows you that it doesn't fit. It shows you that it's wrong. Like you are kind of touching the material in a much more direct sense than if you're just writing like assembly and then pressing run and hoping it works and having no transparency into what's going on behind it. We can't go down this road.
Really?
We simply can't.
Okay, next time.
Next time.